Meghan has got no real income anymore. She's finished.
Right.
The Netflix series is over. There's no great podcast. They don't generate any money. And I don't see where she is going from here. I think she has a major problem.
Your half-sister, has just lost her $100 million Netflix contract. What do you think?
Meghan, off.
What's the title of her show? Love Meghan. For what? To watch? Who wants to watch Meghan Markle bake a pie?
I'm gonna miss their latent fear in interacting with her, that they say something wrong, like call her Meghan Markle instead of it's Sussex now, and just her latent anger underneath every interaction.
My name is Megan Sussex now. Call me Meghan Markle one more time, Mindy f***ing Kaling.
The silence was louder than any scandal, because when the cameras stopped caring, everything else followed. Before the word canceled ever floated through Hollywood air, something colder crept in. Indifference. No outrage campaigns, no loyal fan uprisings, no think pieces screaming injustice, just a slow, eerie vanishing act. 1 week the project existed, the next it felt like a party everyone quietly left without saying goodbye. And in an industry addicted to noise, that kind of quiet is terrifying. This wasn't a dramatic fall. No public execution. No viral backlash bonfire. It was worse. It was the moment decision makers stopped arguing for it. The moment emails lost urgency. The moment meetings moved on. When a show doesn't inspire defense, it doesn't die loudly, it dissolves.
I don't think anybody at Netflix could have seen the show before it went out, because it's not entertainment. It's not edifying in any way. It's really, really bizarre.
Because here's the part nobody says out loud: platforms don't always cut shows because they fail. Sometimes they just stop believing, stop knowing how to explain why something exists beyond a contract obligation. And once belief disappears, the machinery keeps running, but the soul checks out. Then, right as that emotional unplugging was happening behind closed boardroom doors, a new voice entered the picture and tilted the whole conversation sideways. Not with accusations, not with rage, but with a theory that felt almost cruel in its calmness. The problem, he suggested, wasn't truth. It was timing, emotional timing, fatigue, overexposure, the sense that the audience had been asked to fill something on schedule.
To hear them claim in their defense that I don't have any right to privacy is disgusting. They have made my wife's life an absolute misery, my lord.
And while viewers were subconsciously stepping back, another unraveling was happening somewhere far less curated. A courtroom. No lighting design, no editing, no narrative arc, just raw testimony landing heavy in a room built for facts, not feelings. Suddenly, the contrast was impossible to ignore.
Why? Why are you doing this? Why are you demeaning yourself in this fashion? Because Meghan has hired a house which is supposedly worth between £5 million and £10 million. And she's got her famous friends, except of course none of us will have heard of her famous friends, so they're not that famous friends. And she's giving all these really bizarre and quite cryptic guides on how to be the perfect hostess.
Because this was never just about a show, or a lawsuit, or public sympathy. It was about what happens when vulnerability starts to feel packaged, when emotion arrives polished, framed, and emotionally resolved before the audience even sits down. People don't always rebel against that. They just disconnect. The first red flag wasn't a bad review. It was the absence of a second push. No aggressive homepage placement. No executive quotes defending the vision. No reframing campaign. In streaming culture, projects that spark belief get protected, tweaked, boosted, reintroduced. This one drifted, like enthusiasm had already been spent in the pitch phase. Inside industry circles, the mood shift was subtle but brutal. Conversations moved on. Talking points evaporated. The project became something nobody volunteered to explain. That's not allowed cancellation. That's disengagement. And disengagement happens when the simplest question becomes awkward. Who is this for right now? It didn't offend people. It didn't ignite culture wars. It didn't crash under controversy. It landed at an emotional temperature that didn't match the moment. Viewers weren't angry enough to fight. They weren't moved enough to defend. So they did the one thing algorithms can't battle. They scrolled past. And scrolling is deadly because outrage creates data. Love creates data. Even hate creates momentum. But indifference? That's a flat line. Nothing to optimize, nothing to spin. Just a quiet signal that the audience's emotional energy is being spent elsewhere. That's when platforms don't pull plugs with drama. They pause, delay, stop asking what's next. And the second that question disappears, the ending has already started. Then came the commentary commentary that shifted everything from criticism to diagnosis. The claim wasn't that feelings were fake, it was that they arrived like a performance, smooth, structured, fully processed before being shared. Viewers didn't debate sincerity, they questioned presentation, because real emotion is messy. It hesitates, it contradicts itself, it leaves threads hanging. But when vulnerability shows up edited, color-corrected, and emotionally concluded, people instinctively lean back, not in anger, in doubt. Stories stopped feeling discovered and started feeling delivered. And once that shift happens, connection thins fast, not because the narrative is untrue, but because it feels managed, like sadness with a production schedule, like pain with a rollout plan. Then the contrast sharpened. On one screen, carefully framed reflection. On another, a courtroom where emotions spilled without filters. No music swells, no cutaways, just tension, interruption, and a judge reminding someone that feelings aren't evidence. The difference was jarring. One space felt controlled, the other felt uncontrollable. One was narrative, the other was exposure. And audiences, whether they realized it or not, started comparing the two. Because here's the uncomfortable question that began floating through the conversation: if this is what uncontained emotion looks like, what had everything else been? Not fake, not lies, just engineered. And engineering drains intimacy faster than scandal ever could. By now, the issue wasn't any single interview, series, or appearance. It was pattern. Personal revelations landing at precise intervals. Emotional disclosures framed, delivered, then followed by silence until the next chapter dropped. Nothing accidental. Nothing off script. People don't reject vulnerability because it's intense. They pull away when it starts to feel scheduled. When every confession feels pre-approved. When every tear feels camera-ready. When every revelation arrives with context already attached. The audience didn't feel overwhelmed. They felt guided. And once viewers sense they're being steered toward a specific emotional reaction, empathy shuts down quietly, not as protest, as self-protection. Each new project carried weight, but less surprise, less friction, less tension to hold on to. And without tension, attention drifts. What once felt like rebellion started to look like maintenance. Not breaking free, sustaining a position. Not raw, produced. And when emotion starts to resemble branding, audiences don't riot, they disengage. The collapse didn't come with a bang. It came with a calendar. Meg, no dramatic rejection, no explosive headline announcing the end, just slower replies, longer gaps between meetings. Phrases like "let's revisit this later" floating through conversations that used to end with green lights. That's how influence fades in modern media, not with confrontation, but with scheduling. Because once urgency disappears, so does protection. Inside giant entertainment systems, speed equals belief. Projects people believe in move fast. They get defended in rooms you'll never see. They get second chances, new angles, strategic relaunches, but when belief thins out, everything becomes optional. And optional is where careers quietly suffocate. No one storms in to shut the door. They just stop holding it open. That's the phase most outsiders never recognize. Contracts can still exist. Smiles can still happen at events. Public statements can still sound supportive. But internally, the emotional investment is gone. The project is no longer essential. It's background. And background is fatal in an industry built on obsession. This is what that earlier commentary was really pointing at. Not scandal, not exile, but detachment. A system slowly reorganizing itself without centering you anymore. And here's the brutal part. There's nothing to fight. No villain to rally against. No dramatic decision to appeal. Just a growing realization that the world has stopped arranging itself around your narrative. That kind of loss is almost impossible to address publicly. You can't post a statement about declining enthusiasm. You can't launch a PR counterattack against silence. So the response usually becomes louder messaging, bigger declarations, more insistence that everything is thriving. But audiences are sharper than ever. They can feel when momentum is organic and when it's being pushed uphill. That's why this story didn't disappear even as passion cooled. People weren't watching out of loyalty or hate anymore. They were watching to understand the process, to witness what it looks like when a public narrative slowly loses its grip on how it's received. Because once the audience stops waiting to be guided emotionally, the power dynamic flips. Now viewers aren't consuming the story, they're studying it. They recognize something bigger at play, a cultural exhaustion with pre-packaged vulnerability, with pain that arrives polished, with confession that sounds like a thesis statement. We're in an era where emotion is content, and people are getting better at spotting the difference between sharing and staging. So engagement shifts. It's no longer fueled by excitement. It's fueled by curiosity about erosion. How does influence thin out without a scandal? How does relevance drift away without a single dramatic fall? That's the unsettling part. There is no final scene, no cinematic ending where the music swells and the credits roll, just gradual lightness. Each appearance carrying a little less weight than the last, each statement landing softer, each project struggling a bit more to command the same level of attention. Drift is scarier than disaster because disaster ends things. Drift keeps them alive just long enough to watch the fade. And then we arrive at the moment that quietly reframed everything, not on a red carpet, not in a studio, but in a courtroom. A space where narrative control doesn't exist the same way, where emotion doesn't get edited for tone, where frustration surfaced without the usual framing devices to soften it. That moment felt different, not because it was explosive, but because it was uncontained. Observers didn't see a performance arc, they saw accumulation. Years of unresolved tension pressing to the surface in real time. Interruptions, corrections, a judge stepping in to pull the conversation back to procedure. The atmosphere tight, uneven, human in a way polished storytelling rarely allows. And that contrast lingered, because when audiences witness raw emotion in one setting and curated emotion in another, comparisons happen automatically. It raises a quiet, uncomfortable question that sticks long after the moment passes. Which version feels less controlled? Not which is true. Which feels unfiltered? That distinction matters more than most public figures realize. Authenticity isn't judged only by honesty, it's judged by friction, by the awkward pauses, the unfinished thoughts, the parts that don't land cleanly. When everything arrives smoothed out, audiences don't necessarily call it fake, they just stop leaning in. By the time this shift fully settles, there's no dramatic reckoning left to witness, no satisfying narrative closure, just a landscape that looks the same on the surface but feels different underneath. The spotlight still exists, it's just less intense. The attention is still there, it's just less urgent. And in media, urgency is oxygen. What this entire saga reveals isn't failure in the old school tabloid sense. It's something far more modern. Influence doesn't vanish when people turn against you. It fades when they stop needing you to explain yourself, when they stop waiting for your version of events to shape how they feel. That's the real tipping point. Because once a narrative loses its power to guide emotional response, it becomes reactive instead of defining. Each new appearance works harder for smaller returns. Each revelation lands in a space already crowded with fatigue. And that's where the story sits now, not in scandal, not in triumph, but in a strange in-between where the audience has stepped back just enough to see the mechanics behind the curtain. No villain, no hero arc, just a slow lesson playing out in public view. You can script the message, you can polish the emotion, you can time the release, but you can't schedule when people feel something. And the moment they sense they're being told how to feel instead of discovering it themselves, they don't argue, they scroll. Argue, they scroll. Argue, they scroll. Argue.